All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a fast-paced historical forensics lecture today. We're going to unpack what is basically the ultimate 13th century cold case. How did a minor, frankly obscure frontier lord transform into a massive global pop culture phenomenon? The man we're looking at is Ertugrul.
Okay, let's dive right into this and look at our course syllabus. We're going to start with the pop culture legend, weigh the coins versus oral traditions, dig into Byzantine frontier politics, debate his Kai lineage, and finally, look at engineering an enduring legacy. We are stripping away a towering mountain of myth to find that thin layer of actual historical fact.
Starting us off, Section 1, the pop culture legend, the making of a modern icon.
Look, before we can even attempt to reconstruct the real historical Ertugrul, we really have to acknowledge the absolute massive shadow he casts over the world today. Modern media has completely, and I mean entirely, shaped his reputation for most people. You've got these incredibly popular Turkish TV series. There was Kurliç, Osmanic back in '88, and of course the absolute global juggernaut from 2014, Dirilish Ertugrul. The real-world impact of these shows is just staggering. I mean, private housing developments in Lahore, Pakistan literally put up statues of him on horseback just because of the TV drama. And, in this kind of hilarious twist of modern myth-making, local authorities in Ordu, Turkey actually put up a bust of him in 2020, but they had to quickly take it down. Why? Because people realized it looked exactly like the actor from the TV series, not any historical depiction of the actual guy.
Let's move on to Section 2, coins versus oral traditions, the hard evidence. And here is where we have to drop a massive historical bombshell. Despite these smash hit TV shows and the worldwide fame, we actually know almost nothing for absolute certainty about his life. There is a gigantic historical gap. Ertugrul died around 1280, right? But the very first written accounts of his life didn't even appear until 100 to 150 years after the Ottoman state was established. Just imagine trying to write an accurate biography of someone relying purely on word-of-mouth gossip a century and a half after they passed away. Because of that gap, historians are forced to rely heavily on these much later Ottoman narratives, and frankly, their accuracy is highly questionable.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this single quote from an undated minted coin. It says, "Struck by Osman, son of Ertugrul, may his kingdom perpetuate." Osman is the famous founder of the Ottoman Empire, and this tiny coin, struck during his reign, is basically our ultimate undeniable proof that Ertugrul was an actual, living, breathing guy and not just a legend. It's literally a tiny piece of metal carrying the origin story of an entire empire.
But, of course, the hard evidence also gives us a massive headache. If you look at the traditional oral accounts, the ones made famous by 15th century chroniclers and the modern TV shows, they claim Ertugrul's father was Süleyman Shah. But the numismatic evidence? The coins tell a completely different story. We have another coin from that era that explicitly says Osman bin Ertugrul bin Gündüz Alp. So this hard physical evidence clearly names his father as Gündüz Alp, which directly contradicts the whole Süleyman Shah legend. Moving right along to Section 3, the Byzantine frontier politics, life as a marcher lord.
Let's step away from all that genealogical confusion for a minute and try to reconstruct the gritty, everyday reality of his life in 13th century Anatolia. Ertugrul had a very specific, incredibly dangerous job. He was an Uç Bey, which basically means a marcher lord. His main gig was guarding the incredibly volatile frontier between the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and the Byzantine Empire. He's also remembered as a Ghazi, a heroic champion fighting for the cause of Islam. So he wasn't just some wandering nomad, the guy was a highly strategic military commander having to navigate these incredibly complex, constantly shifting, and frankly violent political allegiances right on the border.
So how'd he get there? Well, tradition says his followers from the Oghuz Turks were fleeing the brutal Mongol conquests over in Central Asia, migrating west into Anatolia. And because he offered crucial military muscle against the Byzantines, the Seljuk Sultan Kaikubad I granted Ertugrul land in Karjadağ. It was pure strategy on the Seljuk's part, right? They used Ertugrul and his fighters as a buffer zone to repel enemy incursions. And he was so good at it that he was eventually rewarded with the frontier village of Sogut, which he conquered along with its surrounding lands. That's where he eventually died, and remarkably, Sogut would go on to become the very first capital of the Ottoman Empire under his son Osman.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. Debating the Kai lineage. A 15th century fabrication?
Okay, so we know he was stationed at Sogut, but the story of where his tribe actually originated, that is the subject of fierce, ongoing academic debate. The official 15th century Ottoman narrative insists that Ertuğrul led the Kayi tribe of Oghuz Turks, but modern academic historians like Jamal Kafadar and Heath Lowry point out a huge historical red flag here. If you look at the charters drawn up in the early 1300s, there is absolutely zero mention of this Kayi lineage, none. In fact, these modern historians argue that the whole Kayi connection was just a creative fabrication concocted over a century later by 15th century writers. And the motive? They needed to create a highly prestigious dynastic myth to legitimize the rapidly growing Ottoman state. Now, we're just looking at the sources impartially here, but it's absolutely fascinating to see how history might have been reverse engineered.
And you will not believe just how far these later historians pushed this fabrication. 15th century Ottoman writers like Şükrullah actually traced Ertuğrul's lineage back to Gökalp, the son of the legendary Oghuz Kagan, and then kept going, connecting his bloodline all the way back to the biblical figure of Noah. It's an insanely grand claim, but it just goes to show how desperate later generations were to elevate his status to mythical proportions.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 5. Engineering an Enduring Legacy. From Nomad to Nationalist Symbol.
So the crucial point here is how subsequent empires and even modern nations have constantly utilized and reshaped his memory. It's a wild timeline. We start with his relatively obscure death in Söğüt around 1280. Boom, fast forward to the 15th century, and elaborate genealogies are being spun out of thin air to legitimize his royal descendants. Jump to the late 19th century, and the Ottoman Sultan is actively building monuments to him. And now, in the 21st century, global TV dramas and international statues. It's a phenomenal centuries-long evolution from a frontier marcher lord into an incredibly potent political symbol.
And this brilliantly illustrates how it was done in the 19th century. Facing a massive imperial decline, the Ottoman Empire leaned heavily into its historical roots. Sultan Abdülhamid II literally built the current mausoleum in Söğüt. In 1826, the military named the Ertuğrul Cavalry Regiment in his honor. They even launched an Ottoman frigate and a royal yacht named after him in 1863. The Sultan deliberately, purposefully revived the Ertuğrul myth to fuel 19th century Ottoman nationalism and just try to foster some sense of unity.
Today, that legacy is doing double duty: domestic devotion and international diplomacy. In Turkey, you've got this massive annual festival in Söğüt celebrating the early Osmans, and the stunning Ertuğrul Tekke Mosque in Istanbul. But internationally, over in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan, there's an Ertuğrul Gazi Mosque, completed in 1998, set up explicitly by the Turkish government as a symbol linking Turkey and Turkmenistan. There's even a statue of him surrounding their independence monument, heavily tied to their national spiritual guide, the Ruhnama. Modern governments are literally using his name to bridge nations across borders.
So that leaves us with a final, really complex question to think about. Does the historical truth of Ertuğrul's life actually matter more than the undeniable power of his enduring myth? As we've seen today, the hard facts are incredibly scarce. We're talking a couple of ancient coins and some heavily debated genealogies. Yet this guy's story founded an empire, fueled 19th century nationalism, and right now captivates millions of people around the globe. Thank you so much for joining me for this historical forensics explainer. I really hope this helped you separate the man from the myth, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these fascinating layers of history. Catch you next time.